Hello and welcome all back to Election Time News Australia. Today is Sunday, October 5th, 2025, and we're going to be looking at the 2026 South Australian state election. Election Time News, your one for all things elections and politics, from summations to poll reviews and news. Subscribe below for more content like this about American, Canadian, and Australian elections. Let's make sure to follow the Substack, Threads, Instagram, and X, as well as check out our website, electiontimene.ws, link in the description below, for news feeds and our latest predictions. Also, you can just go to electiontimenews.com. Remember, there's never a dull moment in politics. So now looking on to the video here, it's not all that far away. The 21st of March is under 6 months away now. So that's not going to be that far from now. And so the campaigning season hasn't officially gotten underway yet, but the two parties, Labor and the Liberal, again mostly, are in fact gearing up for this election. They're trying to find candidates and stuff, and so we can already start looking at what we can potentially expect from this election. So, when we're looking over, this is going to be a bit more of a very generalized election or a outlook here for this video. And so, what we can look at first is the 2022 election and what happened here. So, the overall election was very strong, obviously, for the Labor Party. They actually ended up gaining 8 seats, and the Liberals lost 9, which actually they were back. If we look at especially comparing back to 2018, the Liberals had 25 seats to 19 for Labor. So that is, where the baseline was. And then in 2022, Labor gained 8 to become the majority and a relatively resounding one. And the Liberals resigned down to 16 seats. And in the two-party preferred, it flipped by 6.5 points, which is a very sharp shift there. 7 points gained in the primary vote, on almost 40%, just under, for the Labor Party, and the Liberals dropped all the way down to 35%. So that's a considerable shift there. And we can see a lot of the seats, especially in the central Adelaide region, are definitely, except for the very, very slim, very, very central areas over here, did stay Labor, but not by much. And so that's, of course, potentially of concern, especially if these keep ceding away to Labor, if they continue to make gains in some of these somewhat suburban and deep urban regions. Now, of course, there's some things here with, redistricting and such, redrawing boundaries. There's a few extra ones here that don't actually have any concurrent members, if I'm correct. So it's just because of how it's redrawn. So for the map for 2026, it does look a bit different. And so there's nothing here. I'm pretty sure this is actually just one district. I do have to check that out though. Specifically make sure that I have the right map. I did find one, but it wasn't cross-checking properly. So definitely have to look a bit into that. But the 2022 election was a huge gain for the Labor Party. And so obviously they're going to be trying to hold on to this majority with Malinauskas as the premier for the state, but Marshall is now actually out, and it is now Tarzia. So that's going to be the main thing that's going to be changing from 2022. If you look at the polling for the current one, part of that is the leadership approval. And so Tarzia became the leader on the 12th of August, and since then they actually have had us satisfied for Spirit Tarzia, but for Malinauskas actually has dropped just a slight amount. Demos AU did one preferred premier right after, actually not even close to right after. It was half a year after. Not much polling's been done in a while. But a few retiring MPs here, so that's something definitely of note. Even this far out, they've already announced at this point that numbers probably just going to continue to go up. So what exactly can we see so far from this in and of itself? Already, it's just going to be the fact that we have expanding polling from the primary vote. And so the the fact that it started out relatively poor, it was a few months after the election. Both of them actually did drop. Liberals, not by much. Independents and Greens both had gained at this point. But then the Liberal Party started to drop, and if we compare to when the national level elections took place, which was actually in January, this is relatively outdated. You could see even in June, they said that it was out of date. But that's considering continuing to grow, and so there's not much. There haven't been any real recent ones. The most recent one, I believe, was YouGov with this 67 to 33 number, which is 2 to 1 in the two-party preferred vote for for Labor versus the Liberals. And if you remember in 2022, that was 55-45, which is relatively close to how things were nationally in 2025. But that is a large shift. That's that's a 20-point differential. So that would obviously be relatively. Oh, it's right here. So that would be a huge shift. This is actually a bit of a gain for the Liberals, starting out a bit from September into the region, but then you end up with the new Liberal leader there. So this was the poll that was done by YouGov. South Australia Labor poised for record-breaking victory, 2/3 of the two-party preferred vote, 12.4% swing. Just 2 seats in state parliament would be that MRP that they probably did a quick calculation on. And Malinauskas leads Tarzia as preferred premier by 58-point margin, which is an extreme margin, even for that. In the fact that he is premier does definitely give him a benefit, but that is an insane margin to be leading by nonetheless. This would be a bit more expected. Quite a few undecided because they're not sure with Tarzia being a new member there. That was even after a few months. It's still mid-high undecided, but that's now halved. But the fact that it is that high is actually quite impressive, even though he does still have the stats that they know what he is like as premier, that they either like or dislike. So we end up with the voting intention, the primary vote, 48, almost half the vote being taken up by Labor off the bat is definitely another sharp increase. That's, a 10-point gain from 2022. Of course, if we compare all of this to 2022, there's not going to be any huge trends within any of these districts or electorates. So that's going to be the baseline. Just shift the entire map by 10, then you end up with this electorate here, and a few in the inner city as well. Those are more of the outer suburbs are going to be probably flipping those electorates. So that's going to be obviously a concern immediately. And then the two-party preferred being 67-33 just basically gives nothing for the Liberals at this point. Now, One Nation gets 7%, Independents get 8%, Greens 14%. So most likely the Labor Party is getting a lot of that Independent and Greens vote. But decline in Liberal support, if we look at the age groups, it just continues to decline. 25 down to 14 for 18 to 24-year-olds. Labor is actually somewhat consistent. The difference is support for Greens, and then you have One Nation has the highest support amongst younger Gen X. So that's another interesting thing there. Relatively conservative voting bloc, especially even across the world itself. Seeing that also in Canada and the United States. Independents, you had the highest support amongst 50 to 64-year-olds. That's the older Gen X / very young baby boomers. Then the Green Party is just increasing the way down, almost exactly mirroring the Liberal support. Labor is relatively consistent, but is least amongst those younger Gen X groups again. So that's going to be a bit of an interesting trend there. So 66% of their May 2025 federal election voters intend to back them at the state level. That's of the people who voted for Liberals in South Australia from just this past May. 90% of the Labor voters remain loyal. So 20% of the Liberals now back Labor. That in and of itself is going to be a relatively large flip, especially going to be crucial in some of these swing districts. So it's looking increasingly like an absolute blowout. 9% now back One Nation, which is also interesting because that's almost a reversal of some of the slight two-partyization that happened nationally. Not close to as bad as it was in Canada, but still a bit of a higher vote share went to the two main parties. And preferred premier was 72 to 14, with 14% who don't know. Even then, that would be just over a quarter, 72% for Malinauskas. So that's incredibly impressive again, even for an incumbent. And that's coalition's worst result since the Liberal Party's founding in 1944. So that is, again, insane. It could be a worse result for the conservative side of politics in South Australia in 168 years. So this is probably not going to end up holding true, considering how extreme, in fact, this would actually end up being. But I expect this is going to contract a little bit, but they don't have anything here yet. This is Paul Bludger's article on it, and so 67 to 33 is, again, now that's a strong trend there. Of course, with Bludger Track here, they actually have Labor continuing to drop a little bit. They have a few more polls here. So we go into Bludger Track. Now, this looks like federal, so I'm not sure exactly why. Federal 2028. So this is honestly just insanely bad news for the Liberals, especially after they did relatively well in Tasmania not all that long ago, even though, exactly it was YouGov who was expecting Labor to do much better. So that might be a bit of a warning sign on exactly how strong you should be taking YouGov's opinion immediately. They did very well in the federal election, though, so they generally are a bit bullish towards Labor, but sometimes it does end up proving true. So that is definitely something to point out. And this would actually apparently be the worst conservative side of policy since 1857. So that would again be huge. But the Labor, if Labor in South Australia can continue to coalesce support, especially in some of these regions that they didn't lose by that much outside on the west section here of the Bay and the suburban Adelaide area, then that's really going to end up being basically the end of the Liberals in South Australia for the next while. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible for the Liberals to potentially end up making a comeback. Now, this is in fact only one poll. If we already look at the other polls in the... There we go. It is a bit of a gain considering from where it was, but there's only 3 polls so far that have even shown up here so far. And 48-21, but 41 was the lowest one. That was the oldest, though. That was over a year ago. And the more recent ones, but that doesn't mean that trajectories can't turn backward. It depends on campaigning. How well does the Labor Party do as far as that goes? That could end up coming back down. It's not that difficult to actually end up getting it lower than it was. The difficult thing is going to be this two-party preferred vote, which is going to be a bit more difficult to reverse than the actual numbers here. So the Liberal Party, number one, is going to be wanting to get back these 34% of the federal election supporters and get them into their corner. Then they're going to need to coalesce support from One Nation again and basically take all of that and focus on the regions that they didn't win. They didn't lose by that much. There were quite a few relatively close ones, and they weren't by all that much. You had a few that flipped in central... In actually Adelaide itself was only by 6.2, 3.4 in Davenport, 5.5 in Elder, 2.4 in Gibson, 3 in King, 5.4 in Newland, and 4 in Waite. So, I mean, those in and of itself are already relatively close, and that enough would actually almost be enough to flip the entire election at that point, or at least get close. And considering you need 47 seats, 24 needed for a majority, they currently are in need of 11. So that'll be a bit difficult, obviously. That would be... 8. So that'd only be 8. They'd need 3 more. But there's also some other areas that weren't won by all too much. If you can look in the outside region here, that might have been some of they flipped, but there's still a few in the suburbs in here. They're going to have to take back this stretch, though, as well as just almost all of these suburbs that they're continuing to slide in. And so that reversing that trajectory is going to be incredibly difficult in general. But if they can manage to focus on the suburban needs here, they'll probably be able to potentially win back enough. They could potentially even lose some in the rurals. It's going to depend on the suburban and somewhat urban areas because it almost entirely is in Adelaide. And so that's going to be what you're going to focus on. Even these somewhat looks to be ex-urban from the density here. These ex-urban regions are going to be somewhat important. Oh, those are independent seats. They're somewhat important, but that's not going to be the number one focus. Number one focus are going to want to be entirely on what Adelaide wants, and that's essentially what Labour has gotten done, is Central Adelaide and the suburbs, and they've obviously benefited from it. So that's going to have to be the main battle. Potentially just winning back the suburbs would be enough for the Liberal Party to make a comeback. As you can see in 2018, they did win quite a bit of the suburbs, especially all of this central area here and the outer regions of the actual central city, Eastern Hills. They did win a good bit as well. So it's not impossible for them to be able to win back the suburbs. They had them just 7 years ago, but it doesn't look like anything is going in the right direction for them as of right now. And so it could end up being a blowout for Labour, proportions of which we have not seen in over a century. Thank you all so much for watching today's video. Make sure to leave any information, any opinions, anything in the comments. Be sure to keep it civil, though. And be sure to check out our website and subscribe below if you're not already. Thank you all so much and have a fantastic rest of your day.